my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker from the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Sohini Chowdhury. Sohini joined the Michael J. Fox Foundation in 2005, and as Deputy CEO, Sohini oversees the research partnership teams and works closely with the Foundation's executive leadership and board in building the organization's capacity as a stakeholder in drug, and I might add device development into that description, and really bring a patient-focused organization to the Fox Foundation. So we're delighted to hear from Sohini, and then so she can give some remarks, and then invite some of our patients up to grill our patients on their experiences in this project. So, Sohini?
Hi, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and on behalf of the Foundation, I just want to thank you for the invitation to both participate in this really exciting, in some ways I think really kind of unprecedented project, as well as to participate today in this meeting as we talk about the results. I've been asked to talk about our vision with partnering with patients, and as we like to think about it, it's really about figuring out how do we amplify and integrate the patient voice towards developing person-centered therapeutics. And we have an hour for this session, or a little bit under an hour, and I'm not going to give a presentation for an hour. I don't think that would be a lot of fun for anyone, least of all me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the strategy and how we at the Foundation think of the role we can play in informing sort of patient-centered research and patient engagement in research. And then I'm going to call up the co-chairs of the patient participation in this project, who also happen to be very good friends of the Foundation and members of our patient council. So to start off with, is there a... Okay. Perfect. So to start off with, I thought I would just start by talking a little bit very briefly about Parkinson's, because I'm not sure how many people in this room are familiar with Parkinson's. You've obviously heard about it. It is, for some of you, you may not know that it's the second most common neurodegenerative disease after Alzheimer's, and is actually the 14th leading cause of death in the United States. Although estimates, or numbers I should say, are not great, it's estimated that approximately 1 million individuals in the United States and 5 million individuals worldwide are diagnosed with Parkinson's. It's an extremely complex disease. It's extremely heterogeneous. One says this about many diseases, but it holds true with Parkinson's in that if you've met one person with Parkinson's, you've met one person with Parkinson's. The disease course can run very differently for individuals. Although there is, and although there have been quite a few medications that have been approved by Parkinson's, the gold standard was actually, the one that's still used today and is considered the most effective, was actually discovered and used to start treating patients in the 1960s. So that gives you a sense of just how, in some ways, stagnant drug development has been for Parkinson's. The fact that this gold standard is still used today and is considered still the gold standard. And this particular therapeutic, while effective in the early course of Parkinson's disease, loses its effectiveness over time and also begins to generate additional sort of complications for individuals who continue to take that medication. I'll also note that all of the therapies, the gold standard included, that are currently on the market today only address the symptoms of the disease, not the underlying disease pathology. So there is nothing currently that can either slow or halt the disease progression. One of the novel things about Parkinson's is that probably over the past couple of decades, there has been a sort of revolution in the thinking of the disease. When one thinks about Parkinson's, one typically thinks of it as a motor disorder. Many of the symptoms that are presented by patients often are in the motor realm. But over the past few decades, we have begun to refine that thinking and really understand that this is much more than a motor disease. This is a whole body disease. And increasingly over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of research that is targeting the non-motor aspects of this disease, which still today are not well understood. So who are we at the Michael J. Fox Foundation? We are a nonprofit organization that was founded 18 years ago with one goal in mind, which is really to aggressively fund research to find new therapies that can improve the quality of life for patients. The schematic that you have in front of you is something that we use to, that's often used in scientific discourse. And what it does is and I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I realize you probably can't see the lines very well, it's a little pale. But basically what this sort of highlights is that for a patient, their journey with Parkinson's is nonlinear and progressive. And it's important to keep this in mind as we think about novel drug or device development, because this trajectory of the patient journey as they go through this disease is going to be paralleled by a shifting risk-benefit profile and set of preferences that accompany them as they go through this journey. And so this is particularly relevant for what we are going to be discussing today, which is the project that MDIC spearheaded with its collaborators. So circling back to research in general, I think everyone would agree that when we think about drug and device development, therapeutic development broadly, we all agree that we can learn a lot from individuals with the disease. And certainly we at the Foundation have invested heavily in developing cohorts to be able to go back to the patient, to truly understand what is happening with that patient. And many of the things that we can learn from these cohorts by following individuals with the disease and without inform the way we think about biological measures. It informs new thinking about cellular mechanisms and pathways that we can leverage in terms of thinking about new development or therapeutic arenas. It certainly is increasingly a way to begin to think about prevention of the disease. How can we understand who may be at greater risk for the disease? It can inform the way that we think about clinical characterization in terms of what treatment may be best for what type of patient, how we should think about prognosis, subtypes of disease, et cetera. So all of this is really critical. But I want to underline here that studying patients is not necessarily the same as studying what matters to patients. Both are critical, but more often than not, we tend not to focus on what matters to patients. And I think we're beginning to see that this is a new era where that is beginning to be better integrated and to assume greater visibility as we think about novel therapeutic development. At the Foundation, thinking about patients is it's what we do every day. It really is the lens by which we view all of our activities. And when we think about the role that we play in therapeutic development, and many of you may not know this, but we're actually the largest private funder of Parkinson's research. Our budget generally is anywhere between $80 and $90 million that we spend on research a year. So after the NIH here in the United States, we are the largest funder of research. And when we think about how do we amplify or how do we accelerate therapeutic development, we want to make sure that it's not just about pushing the development of different arenas, thinking about the scientific rationale, et cetera, but it's really about, are these approaches going to address patients' needs and preferences? Are they taking into account what truly matters to patients, and will it truly impact a patient's day-to-day existence or their life? Can they spend an extra 3 hours in the car if they live in Texas and they have to drive a lot? These are really practical considerations that matter to patients, and they need to be integrated in the therapeutic development process. So when we think about patient input. It's about sort of how do you translate this from a nice to have into a science, into something that can be integrated in how we approach drug development, therapeutic development, device development. Because at the end of the day, the foundation is a scientific organization. Our CEO is a PhD. We have a research staff of over 20 individuals, PhDs, MDs. We work with key opinion leaders in academia and pharma around the world. We are a data-driven organization, and we believe that patient input can be made can fit that scientific rigor and framework as well. And the nature by how we're trying to do this, and I'm not saying we have the answers, this is just one approach, is that we are trying to figure out how do you integrate the real experts of the disease into your development framework, into your R&D framework. And the way that we've decided to do this is through Fox Insight. And I know there have already been a few mentions of this, but I'm going to take a moment to talk about what it is. Fox Insight is an online study that was launched last October, October 31st, and the goal is to be able to source data directly from patients and those without the disease. There's a small control population included, but to source data directly from patients to understand what is their lived experience with the disease. Patients are, or all, I should say, all participants in the study, they participate in quarterly virtual visits. They participate in surveys. There's novel data collection. A subset of individuals also provide genetic information through a collaboration we've established with 23andMe. To date, in just, I guess it's about 8 months, we have just under 20,000 individuals enrolled in the study. And all of the data that are being collected through this online study are actually going to be made available to the research community beginning next year. This is a 5-year study currently, so we're going to make the data available in real time once it undergoes quality control sort of checking and et cetera. So for us, this is a mechanism by which we can begin to bring the patient voice into that scientific, that R&D framework. And again, we'll have to see what insights can come out of this study. It's an experiment, but it's our stake in the ground in a way to kind of make patient input a science just as we think about drug development and device development. Just to give you some examples of some things that have already been done within Fox Insight. So Fox Insight currently has a set of validated PRO instruments that patients and control participants fill out. And these instruments are really an anchor to be able to define who this cohort is, so that researchers have an understanding of this cohort as they begin to integrate novel data capture approaches into the study. So one case study I'm just going to quickly touch on is something called PD-PROP that is led by Dr. Ira Schulson, who works in the Regulatory Science Department at Georgetown University. Some of you may be very familiar with him. And what he did is he tried a novel approach in Fox Insight where he asked individuals to respond to questions, things like what bothers you the most about PD, in what way does it bother you, how does it affect your daily functioning, et cetera, what is the severity, and use natural language processing to be able to try to identify what's coming out of it. And he did that both in terms of symptoms that individuals typed in response to the question, but then also captured it through voice capture to sort of see if there's a difference between being asked and immediately responding versus reading and thinking about it and replying. So this is right now, this data is being collected and analyzed. The second one is case study is the one that we're talking about today, which is the one led by MDIC and its collaborators. And it's really about trying to identify that what is considered meaningful benefits and risks. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I know that an upcoming session is going to go into much more information about the outcomes and the methodology of it. So I'm going to let that team focus on that bit. But what I did want to talk about is how this particular collaboration with MDIC and others, I think, is such a very interesting and in some ways a really great recipe to follow when we think about how to integrate the patient perspective and patient voice in projects. And my apologies because you obviously can't read this, and I'm not going to take you through every box. But basically, what I wanted to sort of say is that this is sort of the start of this process, which was in fall 2015 when MDIC approached the Michael J. Fox Foundation, not about this project, but about a completely different project related to PCORI. And we talked about that, and about 6 months later, they came back to us, and they sort of said, hey, we have this idea, and we were wondering, would you help facilitate patient integration in this? And that thus began the journey of this particular project. And that was in early 2016. And it really sort of kicked off here in March 2016 during our a patient council meeting that we hosted at the foundation. The patient council is a group of about 40 patients who meet on a biannual basis and really provide a lot of input, guidance, advice, towards the foundation and a whole host of things. And it's a great opportunity for us to hear directly. We have a great network of patients, but its ability to, in 2 days, to really dive deeper with a smaller group of our patient community. So they came and they presented this project, and it was widely and enthusiastically embraced by our patient council, with the result that about 7 individuals from our patient council ended up joining this particular project and became patient scientists, collaborators on this. Fast forward, and you can sort of see that began sort of in spring 2016, and we are here today, which is February 2018, where we're presenting the results of this particular project. All this to say that I think that this particular collaboration is an extremely useful guide when one thinks about how do you integrate and work with patients, with patient organizations, as you're thinking about research projects. So my last slide is really about the Foundation's vision for partnering with patients. And, you know, I think that patient engagement, patient centricity, these are all buzzwords lately. It's become very hip and almost like you have to say that in every meeting. You kind of get that checked off your box. But they're really, I think that what we're seeing is that there is no right or wrong path in terms of how you think about it. Every disease and the nature of what you're doing is going to create a unique set of circumstances for how best to bring in patients and their voice. And the thing that I would argue today is that the underlying component of patients' voices and patients' perspectives should be integrated in R&D. That holds absolutely true. But how one does it or how to integrate it, that can take a lot of different forms. And we at the Foundation, we are, I think, an example of many other patient groups across all disease spectrums who are willing to be able to work with groups and regulators, industry, academia, and be that sort of bridge to be able to think about what's the best way. How do you reach out? Do you have an ability to reach out, or can we be the facilitator for that outreach, et cetera? Again, it'll be different for every disease, but I think that one of the things that we think about is that our role is really to kind of move sort of patient engagement and patient centricity from sort of the hit buzzwords in the moment to kind of just a normal standard practice, so standard that no one really even mentions it anymore because it's just been fully integrated. And I think this particular collaboration that we're talking about today is a wonderful example of just how this has how this can be so beneficial and so integrative and really help move the field forward. So this is going to end this portion of the session, but I'd like to ask my colleagues, my patient committee colleagues, to come on up, and we're going to just have a quick sort of fireside chat where I'm going to ask them to talk a little bit more about their perspectives of this particular collaboration, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to the audience. So as they take a seat, I'll just stay here, I guess. As they take a seat, I'd like to just introduce. Oh, okay. Oh, that's fine. I'll move over. As they take a seat, I'd like to just introduce all the way on my left is Anna Donnelley, and immediately next to her is Margaret Sheehan. And both of them have been long-standing friends of the foundation and members of the Michael J. Fox Foundation Patient Council. And they also are the co-chairs of the patient committee, which has been involved in this particular project. So welcome, and I'm just going to switch. So I want to welcome both of you. And I think I might just start off just to kind of give the audience a little bit of a sense of who you are, to maybe ask you to share a little bit about when you were diagnosed, and also what inspires you to become active as a PD patient in the Parkinson's community? Because I think it's important to get that groundwork before we dive deeper into the actual project that we're all talking about today.
Sure. I was diagnosed 8 years ago. My handwriting had gotten really tiny. My voice had gotten really quiet. I hope you can hear me today. I walked with a bit of a stumble, and I didn't understand what was going on. And I was very lucky because one of the first doctors I saw was a neurologist who understood neurological movement disorders. So I was diagnosed instantly as having Parkinson's. I didn't even know how to spell Parkinson's when I was diagnosed. It was quite a shocking experience, as I'm sure it is for anybody when they're diagnosed with a serious disease. It was in my first year after I'd been diagnosed that I started thinking I should be able to do something to be helpful in this disease, rather than just be a patient and try and take care of myself. Surely there's some ways to do something beyond myself that would kind of address the greater good of people who are diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I had met a number of people who were diagnosed at very young ages, had early onset of Parkinson's, which I just thought was just so unfair that someone should have to deal with it in such an early time in their lives, like my friend Margaret right here. So I had occasion to meet Debbie Brooks, who is one of the co-founders of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and she invited me to join the Patient Council, which, as you learn, meets twice a year and provides different kinds of advice and guidance to the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And it was just too good an opportunity to pass up, so I said yes. That's how I got involved.
Margaret, would you like to share?
Oh, sure. I was diagnosed at the age of 44 in 2014. So I've had Parkinson's for 14 years. I had everything she said I could just repeat. I went to a great doctor who had me hold up my hand because I had been trying to explain to him over the phone what was going on. He said, I need to see you. Because what happened is I was pouring a cup of coffee in my work kitchen, and I realized that I was tired because I was shaking. I wasn't shaking because I was tired, and the light bulb went off, and I called my doctor, and I tried to describe it to him over the phone. He said, come over. He had me put my hands out in front of me, and he said, you need an MRI today. And I said, based on this? And he said, yes, based on that. And I was diagnosed within a week. So I didn't, for somebody 44 years old to be told they have Parkinson's and was shocking, to say the least. And that shock first put me into a funk for about 6 to 8 months where I really just was overwhelmed. And then I started going to conferences. And the first one I went to, Michael J. Fox spoke at, it was very inspiring. And I met Debbie Brooks, and the same thing happened where she asked me to join the Patient Council. I think she needed somebody from the DC area. And then I met Anna, and we are great buddies now because of the Fox Foundation. So if for no other reason than that, I'm very grateful for the Fox Foundation. And there are lots of other reasons I'm grateful for that.
So I had mentioned before that in March 2016, MDIC, FDA, they came to our patient council meeting and they talked about this project. And I'm curious about if you could share a little bit about what inspired you to get involved when you heard about this. What made it interesting? Because you guys became very involved. So I'm curious about what was it? What was that tipping point or inflection point as you were sitting there listening to it that made you think, this is something I'd like to take on?
Well, I guess I would like to say that the presentation they gave was absolutely, it just blew me away. They were very prepared. They came in at the right level. It was not too simplified, but it was, it wasn't, they weren't talking down to us, but they were not speaking in 3-word acronyms all the time and all that too. So it was just a great presentation. They obviously worked hard on it, and that was the kind of structure of what came to be a life-changing moment for me. Because what really struck me was the craziness of this constant P-value. We had never heard, you had never heard of that, right? We still don't really know what it means.
Oh, you heard it.
I mean, we do, but, ask us to try to explain to somebody else, we're probably not doing a very good job. But they really did such a great job of distilling the problem, the issue, that the patient wasn't involved in determining whether a clinical trial was successful or not. Other than as guinea pigs, the fact that a product was either approved or not approved without the patient's input on whether they viewed the result as successful for them just was astounding to most of us who joined the committee.
I don't think we had any idea what they were asking of us. And when we were asked, do you want to help? It sounded intriguing. They were intelligent, respectful, engaged, and excited individuals. It was really fun to meet them. And it seemed like maybe this was that little kernel I was looking for, a way to offer a little bit of my own thinking, of my own questioning, to a process that could result in some better good for others. So it was just intriguing. It was a neat opportunity, and 7 of us volunteered. We ended up calling ourselves, by the way, Team Awesome.
The whole group.
Lauren is responsible for that.
So let's talk a little bit. What was your role initially in this project, and how did it evolve? And what were sort of the activities that you participated in as being collaborators, co-collaborators in this?
I think it evolved a little bit over time, but I also think we did a little bit of everything. There were bi-weekly conference calls that we participated in. There were meetings that we attended. People from the team, FDA and so on, came to the patient council meetings. We reviewed, there were 10 different iterations of the protocol, which we reviewed, provided comments on. There were written definitions of the terms that were going to be used in the protocol, which we read and made comments on. There were abstracts written for presenting findings at different conferences or in journals, and we had commented on those. We then were invited to add our names to those abstracts, which was remarkable. So anything that went on, I feel like we were invited to participate in and treated as equal members of the team.
Yeah, I think here's what happened. They treated us like we were experts, and when I said, what am I an expert in? They said, you're an expert in having Parkinson's disease, and that's what we need you for. We need you to be as honest and as detailed as you can be, as you feel comfortable being about living with this disease. Because we have all the statistics, we have talked to doctors, we have, gathered data, but we don't really understand what it's like to live with Parkinson's on a hour-to-hour, day-to-day basis. And we don't know what it's like to have a disease that has no cure and that is progressive. So we provided that context that made it so much easier, I think. I'm kind of bragging here, I'm sorry. But it made it easier for them to stay within the lines and focus on what was important.
And when we were talking, when we were prepping for this, you said, I can't remember who it was, I think it might have been you, Anna, who had sort of talked about the fact that you sort of, not that you kind of, pushed your way into calls, but even calls that weren't necessarily per se immediately relevant to maybe activities you were going on, you asked, maybe it was Margaret, you asked to join. And even if you didn't understand everything, you still felt there was great value in that kind of just being part of the overall process, not just a sort of a track, if I could call it that.
Right. There were calls, originally there were calls scheduled with the patient scientists, and then there were the bi-weekly calls were without the patient scientists. And Anna and I, as co-chairs, pushed ourselves into the bi-weekly calls, and we just said we'd like to participate in those, mostly as observers, just to keep up with what's going on, just so we know, not to influence the decision-making necessarily at that level, but just to keep abreast of the whole project. And of course, over time, we were integrated into it, and we did become more or less full participants in those calls as well. Now, that was just the two of us. That was not all seven of us.
Our engagement was not staccatic. It wasn't episodic. It wasn't one meeting here and then one meeting there. It was continual. And it was such a wonderful experience and a great surprise.
So you mentioned this term, patient scientist, Margaret, and I know we heard it earlier. And it has been shared with me that you had a very immediate visceral reaction to that term that wasn't necessarily positive. So I was curious if you could talk about that. I mean, it wasn't negative, but I would say maybe more questioning. Could you talk a little bit about your reaction to that term and what that term now means to both of you?
Sure. I will analogize it to a story about my daughter. We were at a party with a band when she was 4, and the band announced that the next dance was for females only on the dance floor. She came running across the dance floor to me, looked up and said, "Mom, what's a female?" And I said, "You're one." And she said, "Great." And she went out and started dancing. And that was what happened with me with this term patient scientist. I see the person who I went up to and asked, "What's a patient scientist?" Because I really wanted to get involved. Something about this presentation just really woke up something inside me. And I said, what qualifications do you have to be a patient scientist? And you said, you just have to be a patient. I said, yes! So I thought, you had to be a scientist first and then a patient. I didn't realize that the science was the science of having Parkinson's.
Anna, what about yourself? Thoughts about that term either before or now after you've gone through this process?
I cherish it. I think it's a wonderful title to have.
I think that says it all. So let's talk a little bit about the project now in terms of what are some of the things that you learned? What are the most impactful things that you learned being part of this? Because, I think there were learnings on all sides, but I think it's also important to recognize that what we learn from a patient perspective going through a project can also be equally important as we think about other ways that we can sort of build on top of collaborations like this one.
One of the things I learned is what is not known commonly about Parkinson's. This is a disease that has affected large numbers of people over a long period of time. There's been a fair amount of research. There's a hefty literature, but there's a lot that is unknown in a common sense. The notion of pain with this disease, the notion of depression with this disease, and a whole host of other things which wasn't front and center as this project started going and became discovered by patient input, talking about the kind of issues that we confront. That was a surprise, but one addressed quite nicely by the team.
I learned that the SBA has really crappy conference phones. I mean, you could hear them, but you couldn't understand them. It was so muffled, and it was just, well, anyway. Seriously, what I learned was that what I was most impressed by was the incredible power of collaboration. This was obviously, MDIC itself is a collaboration, and then this was a collaboration within a collaboration, and it was just amazing. Everybody worked together. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so even when we work together, we aren't really working together, if you know what I mean. So these people had one goal in mind and a unique skill set that they brought to the table. And I don't know whether it was the brilliance of whoever picked the team or just the brilliance of the team itself, but it just worked so well because you weren't outside your area trying to do something you weren't an expert at. RTI knows survey design. MIT knows wonky stuff about models. MDIC knows speaks for the industry and the FDA, and then of course CDRH knows their approval process and what it will take to convince a regulator to shift, make a sea change and allow patient preferences to be incorporated into clinical design, clinical trial design, and then of course us. And that was just brilliant, and it was so powerful, and it was such a joy. I really look forward to the calls more than anything else in my week during that period of time.
It's unusual in my experiences for people from different disciplines to come together and be comfortably collaborative, be comfortable in their respect for each other's expertise or discipline, if you will. And that was not true here. The respect across organizations and disciplines was profound. I think we felt it too. I think we felt respected for whatever we offered at the table.
So you've talked in very positive terms. I'm wondering, were there challenging aspects in being involved in this process, aside from the teleconference issues? But were there things that were challenging or difficult in your roles in this process?
I would say the only thing that really, well, probably not the only thing, but the only thing I can think of right now is the pace. I mean, one of the things about having 5 different organizations involved in something, one of them being the government, is that, things, I remember when we got the first timeline or agenda, and I thought, 18 months, what are they going to do? Are they going to, start with a stone tablet? I mean, what, in my field, speed is very important, and in my disease, speed is very important in the sense that, I'm now 14 years in, and I'm tired of having Parkinson's, and I'm sure other people with other diseases are tired of having those diseases. And, I remember being very dismayed at the timeline, and then I realized that actually over the process of the project that the timeline was, if anything, it was impressive. It just takes so long to get this stuff done. I mean, they really were starting from scratch. Brett came up with a survey that literally didn't exist before this. And it's just, the survey was good because they got input from everybody and how to design the survey. So I ended up not feeling like people were dragging their feet. I just didn't have an appreciation at the beginning for how long it was going to take.
Anna, thoughts from your perspective?
Keeping up with Margaret's humor was the hardest part. Second difficulty was really truly understanding the Pvalue. I still don't, even after that brilliant presentation this morning. Thank you, Dr. Professor. The technological aspects, the formulas that show's going to show you, just went over my head.
So do you think you surprised your collaborators in any particular way with your participation? No?
No, I think we surprised them a lot. I mean, what? Surprise. No, we just, I think one of the ways that we help define the attributes. And I think most of the people who Anna touched on this earlier.
Yeah.
See, I'm giving you credit for something.
Thank you.
Okay. That, people think that there was a surprising to us lack of appreciation of the full scope of what it means to have Parkinson's. And there would be discussions where we'd say, well, what about, the fact that, people have problems sleeping, or people have problems swallowing, or people have problems thinking clearly sometimes. And, this is all news to a lot of the people involved in this project. And so I think that was surprising, and what was surprising to me was that we were listened to and incorporated. And a perfect example of that is the pain results that you guys are going to hear in a while. Pain wasn't even on the list of attributes. And it turned out to be one of the most important factors in this study. And it was the patient aspect of Team Awesome that brought pain up as an attribute, and in the next iteration, there it was. So, I think we taught each other a lot about various aspects of the project, and I think it was always done in the spirit of trying to not just speak for ourselves, but to speak for the whole Parkinson's community, which was really hard. I should have mentioned that in the what was hard thing. It was very hard to remember that I wasn't speaking for myself. I was speaking for everybody in the country who has Parkinson's, and I don't necessarily fit the profile. I'm relatively young, not super young, but for Parkinson's diagnosis I am, and I am relatively active, and I had to think about your classic Parkinson's patient too when I was, coming up with these attributes and talking about the disease.
Anna?
I don't know if this answers your question, but what I was thinking about is one of the really nice things about being involved with this work was it allowed me to touch base with other people with Parkinson's in a new kind of way. For example, I do a boxing class called Rock Steady Boxing, which is a special boxing class just for people with Parkinson's, which has been an amazing addition in my life, really very powerful. But all my PD buddies who I box with, we talk about Parkinson's in terms of our own experiences, which is helpful in informing some of the contributions I've tried to make in the study. But importantly, I was able to engage them in the study. So they reviewed one of the early surveys, and they did some questionnaires to help out as well. So my relationship with them was broadened and deepened, which was a nice surprise. I didn't expect that at all.
So I'm going to wrap up with one last question that I'm going to pose, but then we set aside about 10 minutes for any questions that the audience may have. So my last question would be, what advice, based on your experience with this particular project, what advice would you offer other teams who are interested in conducting a similar project?
I'm from Chicago. You know about voting in Chicago? You vote early and often. And that would be my advice to anybody who wants to involve patients. Involve them early and keep them involved.
Yeah, my advice is similar. I'll take probably a little bit longer to spell by now. But nobody likes to waste their time. Nobody wants to be appointed to a project, a committee, a team, and just for show. And so if you're going to involve patients, make sure you ask concrete questions so that you can get good answers, and make sure you incorporate what they say in or at least think about what they say, and you may decide to reject it, but don't do it because it is in or hot or whatever. I mean, you will lose people fast if you don't actually incorporate what they're telling you and give them meaningful ways to participate. And the other thing I would say is that there are multiple ways to include patients. I mean, Anna and I were very much involved from beginning to end, but there's two of us. There was the larger patient committee, there was the patient council, there were the survey participants, there were the pre-test people. So you don't just have to pick one way to involve patients. In fact, you shouldn't. You know, thousands of people took the survey. They were, you know, if you add up the cumulative time of those thousands of people taking the survey, you probably get somewhere close to the cumulative time that Ann and I spent, because we're just two people. So involve patients appropriately along the way, and don't discount any step of the way, because everybody has a role to play.
Thank you. So with that, would you like to see me? Okay. I'll just open it up to the audience if you have any questions for Anna, Margaret, or myself.
With all of the change taking place in healthcare, the healthcare culture itself, what things that I hear you saying, this is another cultural impact on healthcare. How do activities this early find a way strategically to deal with overcoming cultural resistance of the healthcare disciplines? Like, if we begin to do these kind of things, how long is it going to take before medical schools teach new physicians that this is how healthcare and medical science and device approvals is going to work?
So I don't think I have an answer for that pretty large systemic question that you posed, but what I will say is I think you raise a very important point, which is that when we think about the medical research enterprise, there are certain stakeholders who have embraced the concept of patient integration, patient voice being part of that paradigm, and there are others that haven't. And I would actually argue that one of the slowest groups to integrate that are often the academics, at least within Parkinson's, where I feel that in our experience, it is very variable when you speak to a physician who is designing the trial protocol on behalf of a sponsor or whoever, who has actually ever thought about integrating a patient perspective in reviewing that protocol, for example, and understanding the burden that an individual may have to go through for each study visit, or doesn't think about reporting results back to trial participants. Still not accepted across the board. Only certain do it. So I think what you're highlighting is that there is discrepancy, but I think the way that we try to view it is that if you can begin to show success, like this project, in certain areas, and you're able to publicize it, and one of the things from a foundation standpoint that we love about this is that you are being public. We work a lot with industry where we integrate patients and we help facilitate, and naturally they don't talk much about that because it's all within sort of, confidential things. So there's limited things we can say, but in something like this, which is so public, this is a wonderful example of being able to show the success and the benefit of doing things like this publicly and widely. And my hope is the more examples we have of this, the more it begins to sort of resonate, and we all have to kind of push those that are lagging behind too. But I don't have a better answer for you because it's a very challenging, it's a very challenging environment.
I will just say one thing, and that is that the FDA was not only involved, but they spearheaded this. And so the bottom line is, will the FDA approve clinical trials based on patient preferences? And I think the answer is yes, if they're done correctly. And that should reduce a significant barrier to biopharmaceutical companies and academics, designing clinical trials based on patient preferences. If the next step in this process were, all right, now we've got to go convince CDRH that this works, we'd be in a very different place. And the other thing I would like to say is that if we If this study just comes out and is a burst of fireworks and then nothing, we haven't done our job. So what we all need to do is be advocates for this, and as Sohini said, show that it works and that it can work and that it doesn't have to be expensive and really time-consuming. It will actually, the process from beginning to end probably will be significantly shorter. So I think there's work to be done. We're all diplomats, and we have to spread the word.
Yes, Margaret and Anna, as a Parkinson's patient for 10 years, I'm just so proud to have you both representing the patient tribe. So thank you both, because I think what you're doing is just amazing. I have a question that I'd like to actually pose also to Dr. Lowe and the panel on your views on this, the right to try license. I'm somewhat torn because, I've been a DBS subject on patient research for 5 years, spending hundreds of hours, and I encourage all of my compatriots to get involved in clinical research. I think it's our duty, it's important, but I was recently involved in a dilemma where I was actually with Todd Chair, and we evaluated a phase 3 protocol for a drug, and we reviewed the safety data. It looked very safe, and I've gone out recommending other patients to get involved in that trial. Now, unfortunately, that trial resulted in 5 deaths. And so, there's this dilemma that we face, right, as patients. I mean, I, for one, don't want to have Parkinson's. I don't want my kids to have Parkinson's. The desperation of trying to volunteer for clinical trials is really high. But at the same time, I felt a little bit pang of guilt of recommending what I thought was very safe. The data looked good. And so this right to try situation is I think, is a moral dilemma, right? I would certainly pay to be in some of these trials for these Hail Mary, cures, but at the same time, I think we have to face the dilemma. So I'm curious, as the patient panel, how do you view this right to try license?
Dr. Loeb?
Far be it from me to lecture this audience on how to make a choice regarding life or death situations. It's a very personal decision, and that's one of the reasons why patient preferences actually matter. And in the analysis that Cho and Brett will talk about regarding patient preferences, you'll see a difference, a spectrum of differences among different groups. There are patients that are very risk averse, that have not ever tried deep brain stimulation, that are happy to live with their current symptoms of Parkinson's right now. And for those individuals, it is not appropriate for them to be involved in something as risky as the kind of therapies that we're talking about. But there are other patients that feel very, very differently, that are desperate, that have much more severe symptoms, that are willing to try because they just don't want to live with the symptoms that they're currently dealing with. And for those patients, a right to try is actually a godsend as opposed to a potential death sentence. So I don't think there is an answer that fits everybody's profile, which is one of the reasons why we're arguing that one size doesn't fit all, that you really need to make explicit what the risks are. And for those patients who are willing to try and are willing to do so not only for their benefit, but for the benefit of their heirs and others, I think they're heroes, in my opinion, and they're taking on the kind of risks for the rest of us. But I think in this case, explicit disclosure about what the risks are and letting individuals make that kind of decision for themselves is the only ethical way that I can see for proceeding.
Could I say something? Hi, folks. I'm Murray Sheldon. Andrew mentioned me. But for a lot of people know me in this project, but don't know me very well personally. I've actually been a patient for over 25 years, and I've practiced medicine for 20 years. And so I've looked at these things from different approaches, and now, of course, I've had the opportunity to work at the FDA with regulatory approaches. The key is to have this as an availability. It's impossible to advise. It's impossible to make right choices or wrong choices, but at least there's on the table the availability of the possibility of doing something differently and not having government regulators say what you can and cannot have. The voice of the patient is so critical in healthcare and in any other care and in interactions amongst people. So at the very least, the bottom line is that sort of opportunity needs to be there for people, and I think that's the most important part.
Yeah, as I said, I'm a lawyer, and so disclosure is a very big part of, this kind of discussion. Nobody sets out to kill people. And so as long as everybody is conflict-free, or at least relatively conflict-free, and that there is the best disclosure that can be given at that time based on what is known at that time, I think that is, the risk-benefit trade-off is fair. It's only not fair when somebody hides something or has a conflict or is, motivated by the wrong thing. So with respect to your moral dilemma, I think my personal opinion is that you didn't do anything wrong at all, and you did the best you could with the information you had, and that's all that can be expected of anybody.
Any other questions?
Yes, here in the back. So I do want to go to a couple of themes. So one is the question about what about academics and how can we get them to think more openly about the whole science of patient engagement. And one of the concepts that we've looked at is to catch people, so to speak, early in their careers. So it might be the doctoral student, it could be the postdoc, and actually train them up and train also at the same time those who will be the patient advocates for a particular condition, because then I think you have an almost unbeatable team with respect to dealing with senior investigators. So Michael J. Fox Foundation might be something to consider, is invest in those early participants. The question I have for all three of you is, how do you, because we're starting, I'm from the AMA, I should have said that. I'm Kathy Blake and I'm a physician. How do you think, or what are the best ways to engage physician or patient scientists? Because we hear a lot about the need for proper training, for orientation and things like that. So what do you think are the essential ingredients to make that a good match?
I don't think we had any orientation. I think we were just put in the mix, and I think it worked fine.
I think I would add to that the key ingredient is motivation. And the key to that is it can be very self-centered in the sense that if this works, it may speed along a cure, and that might benefit me. That's okay. But what really works best to motivate patients is to explain the nature of the problem so that they understand it, and then give them a concrete way to fix it, or at least to start addressing it in a positive way. So I think motivation is probably more important than anything else, because Anna and I have stuck it out to the end, And we are going to be sad when it's over because we have thoroughly enjoyed our involvement in this process, and not just for personal reasons, but because we're having an impact. So find motivated people. And you're right. I mean, the great thing about this project was they had the Michael J. Fox Foundation that has the patient council. They also had the survey participants, Fox Insight. So it was kind of, relatively easy. But to the extent that you can replicate that process of finding patients that, they live there all over the place. They don't necessarily gather all that much as a group. And how do you find them? That I don't know, other than try to find an association of patients like the Michael J. Fox Foundation and tap into their resources.
I think one of the keys that certainly motivated us to stay involved is that we were listened to and we were shown tremendous respect. We weren't brought into the room, asked a question, give an answer, and then dismissed. We were engaged in the process. So we didn't have an orientation. We didn't have someone sit down with us for hours explaining what was going to go on. But from the day one, when we said something, people said, oh, aha, okay, good. And then we saw changes occur in, let's say, a protocol design as a result of something Margaret had said. So we knew we were being listened to. And that is motivation enough to stay engaged, I think.
Thanks, Sohini and Margaret and Anna for this panel and for everything. So thank you. We're going to take a short break. We'll come back in about 10 minutes, and then we're going to talk about results. So come right back, guys.